Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel and to the showcase, or not the showcase, but the guide through basically the timeline of battles during Tonnreaf's war, though for this video I am only focusing on Destinal as it was the main theatre of this conflict. And to begin with, we will start at the beginning. Tonnreaf at this point had held this portion of Destinal, the old Rolothine portion, the old home of some of the Dracons, and one of their original birth points for a fair while, but any action that he had really taken had been fairly silent as well, and the Dracons effectively remained ever watchful. But around 280 BGS, Dracon scouts under Maltoth start noticing that the fire pits are starting to awaken a lot more, and it's noticed at the Storm Peak as well, and the Dracons have to start potentially preparing. And currently under the leadership of Khansir, their first motion ends up actually being a rather dire mistake. Maltoth leads an expedition into Rolothine to investigate what was going on, and just south of the northern fire pits they get ambushed, and most of the force gets completely destroyed at the disaster of Rolothine, and very few, including Maltoth, manage to escape. But in doing so, they are now very much aware that there are many legions already starting to form. And with that in mind, Khansir begins the mobilization of the Dragons of Darenthal. However, this is the only action that actually happens on Destinal for 280 BGS. Most of the other areas are sending warnings and preparation messages, most notably, for at least the beginning time, to the Wood Elves. And I will, in the edit for this, hopefully around about this point, showcase a more political border showcasing map of Destinal, so that people can actually understand, because I understand that the parchment one is a bit difficult to see in some cases. But in 278 BGS, Tonnreaf actually launches his first main offensive maneuver outside of the territory, and instead of attacking Darenthal directly at first, and I will also note that this wall is known as the Tavicorn. At this point, it's not yet existing, it's just I put it onto the map to represent it. And the forces move forward and they engage the Storm Peak, the home of the Silver Paladins, the most elite of all Dracon warriors on Destinal, as well as many enchanters. And for 9 days the Dracons repel the assaults, and they take heavy losses, but they do actually succeed in being able to fully repel the force, although it severely costs them. Though it is also very notable that they did get some assistance from their kin over at the Sister Realm Isles, who sent ships to basically support from the sea, taking advantage of the fact that at this point Tonnreaf's force have no access to ports or things like that, aside from small clusters that aren't enough to mount any major incursion. And I will also just add in a side editor's note for this. There are woodlands and tree lines about, but not all of them are filled in on the map. because yeah, the major ones like Arakan and Erlan are not Erlan. What would become the Darkened Wood? They are, but like small little clusters of woodlands and things are not always filled in. So that was a choice on my part. But after the 9 days of Silver, Khanzir advances with a fully mobilised Drakon army and positions himself here, right at the head of the Rolathine Passage, understanding and with the full knowledge that the Wood Elves, currently, who had been warned about this after after the disaster of Rolathine, the Wood Elves currently under, gotta get the name right here, Farallon, are beginning to mobilise and move, and they're crossing through here, so eventually the Drakons will be joined by another protector race. However, after 4 years of watching and different preparations being made and the marches and everything, Tonnreaf attacks again, and he this time unveils both the Quarkior, which are more chaotic, almost like assassin-like demons, as well as the large hulking Gorothadar within his ranks, which had not been seen on Destinal in many, many years. And the Drakons just get... The Drakons are fierce warriors, but the sightings of these creatures that they had no prior warning to definitely does an impact, and it ends up with a full retreat, and that retreat after a fight that the Drakons attempt to win but bears no particular success, they fully retreat back to Darrenthal within the realm of their own kingdoms. And at this point the Wood Elves, they did not fully march out at the beginning of the 4 years. They were beginning to mobilise and then they marched, and Farallon is a cautious leader, so they have not made it fully into Central Rollock yet. They're around the northern area, but upon this disaster, 74 BGS, and after that begins a 7-year onslaught where Tonnreaf just launches wave of attack after wave of attack against the Drakons, whilst also pushing more forces into Central Rollock to just not so much fully assault the Wood Elves, but to just make any effort they could to try and aid the Drakons into an utter nightmare. And with all of this in mind, at some point throughout those 7 years, though it's not fully established, Tonnreaf does destroy the last of the Silver Paladins who were... Now, it is notable that there are other Silver Paladins about, it's just this is the primary area for them, and the remaining enchanters, and occupies the Storm Peak, changing it to the Shadow Hill. And he undergoes converting the fortress and turning it into basically an advanced base. So now he has both Tharlog, this fortress here, as well as now the Shadow Hill. And the 7-year onslaught continues through and through, and the Wood Elves do actually attempt to make a move where they advance to the foot of the peak, actually fully crossing through. However, Tonnreaf actually receives a warning about this. And the Wood Elves, instead of wanting to actually try to assault the Shadow Hill, not knowing how much magic would be there against them or anything, they do make the effort to actually turn south and try to start encroaching in. And like I said, this is a 7-year onslaught. There are no particular major battles that stand out in any of this. It's just a overall conflict, but the base summary of it is that eventually the Wood Elves grind to a halt and actually start getting pushed back by the momentum of the demon legions, and they get driven back to the Northern Passage. So Tonnreaf is now pushing against both the protector races that remain on Destinal. And at this point, it is also notable that Galeria had been going around the human kingdoms and had informed at the very least Rovalor and Tarasil to begin their mobilizations just in case they were needed if the protector races could not beat Tonnreaf on their own. And eventually, within 266 BGS, two very major events occur. Khanzir actually, Tonnreaf relents a bit on the 7-year onslaught, having done the damage through to about 269, 268 BGS as he needed, and now decides to approach attacking the Dracons in a different way, where he starts using more corruptive power to try and assail Khanzir's mind more than his own defences and forces of his kingdom. And the Dracon mage, and it is notable that Khanzir is a mage of Sapphire, more healing and life, he ends up travelling with his guard to the now Shadow Hill, attempts to duel Tonnreaf, and is not heard from after 3 days, and his armour is then suddenly shown. And for those of you who would like to know what actually happens to Khanzir, that's being noted in some of the lore that happens more around the lands of Arasin. So, and it has been noted in some of the other videos already, or at least some of it. Some of it is being kept under wraps until actual writing. But the Dracons have now lost their leader, and around about the same time, Tonnreaf, again, he still launches the odd skirmish against the Dracons, but for the majority now, he's putting his pressure against the Wood Elves, and he pushes them back into the Northern Passage, the thin, essential causeway between the Gulf of Rolog and the Iceberg Peaks. So, thin, narrow passageway, and the Farallon instructs his forces to withdraw back to Erelgarth, or at the very least back to the end of the ruins of Zebulcorn. And 500 elves are picked to basically be the rear guard and to hold off to buy the time for the rest. And amongst these elves was one very close friend of Farallon, in fact his second in command, called Gwenakar. and this would become known as the Stand of 500 Shields. And they fought tooth and nail against the Maeda demons until only 100 were left and had no real choice but to have to flee. They had no other option, they could not stand. And it is notable that the elven bodies were almost even though there were 400 of them in such a tight compact space, it was difficult to see any of them because their quality and skills as warriors was so much more than the demons. But Farallon remained holding, and for 2 days he held the Maeda at the eastern entrance to the northern passage until the demons end up getting driven off, but Farallon and the Wood Elves do not pursue. So for the time being, at this point in time, the Wood Elves are positioned at Sebelkorn, whilst the Dracons are down in Darenthal, and all of northern and central Rollock has basically fallen to Tonnreaf. And for a time now, aside from the odd skirmish against each side to keep them tense, there is no real conflict that actually happens directly battle, because Tonnreaf's forces get to work and they construct what is known as the Scorching Ports around about here on the Gulf of Rollock, and it takes time obviously, but they don't build them like to these massive grandeur ports or harbours. They just build them enough to be able to hold boats and move troops, and they begin their construction and they focus quite heavily on that, whilst also attempting to pretty much obscure any of their foes from really seeing what's going on. And this is in 265 BGS that the beginning of this happens. And whilst the Wood Elves were not fully certain, Farallon knew that the lack of an attack meant something else was happening, and it caused concern. And by late 265 BGS, so several months later, the makeshift Scorching Ports are constructed, and the makeshift, rather pathetic, in all honesty, ships for the demons have actually started disembarking and crossing the Gulf of Rollock towards the Salbanoth. The whole plan behind this was, seeing as the Wood Elves were away from their territory, or the main force was, they were going to send a force through the Salbanoth to either assail the other contingent of Wood Elves within the Wood of Arakan, or push them through to Westland and into the main heart of Erelgarth, whilst another demon force would likely engage Farallon across the northern passage, so the Wood Elves would have little defence to be able to hold their own home. And it would have potentially worked if it hadn't been for Wood Elf scouts at the Salbanoth who spotted it. They spotted the ships, and but before the scouts could actually move to warn Farallon, another onslaught occurs across the northern passage, tying them together. And it was notable that at this point the demons had actually, on the Dracon front, they had been focusing particularly around Karnas and not the rest of the territory like the southern Rollock. They were primarily focusing on the nearest Dracon settlement. But at this point they relaxed that effort so that Tonnreaf can focus more of his dedicated forces against the Wood Elves to properly ensure that they are at the very least bloodied enough that they're not going to be a problem. to his north, because essentially without them there is no real northern force to aid the Dragons. And it would have potentially worked, only another force ends up entering the fray. The already pre-mobilized forces of Tarasil, the first human kingdom to actually be involved in this conflict. Well, in Tonnreaf's war at the very least. And together, from Arakan, the Wood Elves under the current Watcher of Arakan, Thoronthia. I just smile at that name if anyone knows the Twitch name and the fact that I reference him as my Twitch name. He's the current holder of the Spear of Arakan as well. But those Wood Elves, alongside forces from Tarasil, particularly Tenmark, the only territory to the north of Arakan that's human occupied, well, by Tarasil at least, they move and engage the demons at the Winter Mists in the Salbanoth, and not only for this battle and the potential protection it holds, but also for the factor that of what this battle leads to. The Salbanoth is arguably one of the most significant battles in Tonnreaf's war. I would probably put it, it's not the biggest by any stretch, but I'd actually probably pit it at the very least within the top 5. And although it'd probably be only about 5 thinking about it, but the Wood Elves and the humans of Tarasil, alongside other Wood Elf forces that come from the Westland, they're able to engage the Meader before they can really establish themselves. They attack the camp and destroy every single demon that they can find. It's a brutal affair and they don't come out unscathed, but they do claim victory, and in doing so they protect not only actually the back of Rovlaror, but also the Wood Elves from having their home get exposed and potentially destroyed. And this battle I'm noting particularly because the Salbanoth then becomes the home of the city of Cath Imril. And Cath Imril, whilst it is a human city, it is the human city with the most amount of elven culture melded into it, and it becomes not only a real key spoke for Tarasil for many, many years, but after Tarasil has its northern territories break to the northern realm, much after what happens with the Wood Elves and the humans expand further north, but the northern realm eventually becomes House Teelic. And House Teelic are where the main character, or at least some of the main characters from the Defenders of Aphalas trilogy, hail from. So the Battle of the Salbanoth is quite significant for a lot of that. And it shows a closer relationship between the Wood Elves and the humans that had been for quite some time. But the construction of the city does begin quite hastily, and more defences are established on the river, on the Gulf space. And in the north, the Wood Elves are able to successfully repulse the onslaught as well. It's also notable that during this, as a little editor note, some of the demons do actually get as far and start to try and sack the Westland, but one of in 264 BGS. This is, but Farnlear, who was essentially left in charge of the lands of the Wood Elves in Farallon's absence, he ends up sallying out with what they had left and ends up ferociously just pushing back. So you have forces of Tarasil led by whoever currently would be leading Tenmark, who I haven't got far enough on the character trees to know the name of. But, well, actually that's not true. I might, if I have the name, I will put it in an editor note. You have Thorontia and you have Erilyn. Erilyn? No, Farnlear. I'm getting characters confused. The actual conflict around the Salvador is not actually wrapped up in 264. It ends up going into 259. 259? No, 263. Yeah, I was going to say 200. Sorry, I'm rereading through notes. And it took for 2 days, and there we go, that's the name, Vidon. Queen Vidon of Tarasil. She personally came forward and led them. But I'm still going to find the Lord's name for Denmark. But the Salbanoth gets concluded, and at this point Tonnreaf was still basically just thrashing against the Dragons over and over again. The Wood Elves had success with some aid, had successfully managed to push him back and hold in the north. And for quite some time, from at least for those fronts, for many years, in fact, only until up until 255 BGS, so it's actually a gap of almost a decade in some cases, there's an eerie quiet that happens. The Dracons are really the only front going on. The Wood Elves end up establishing more forts and outposts than anything, as more of the warriors end up going back, but they alter and they change. The Salbanoth is under construction as Cathimril, but then it gets unveiled why the quiet had been ongoing, because in 255 BGS, Tonnreaf launches a mass 2 phase assault against the Kingdom of Rovlaror. He attacks through the gap here at the end of the Dracon territory into the land of Haracloch, and he also assails the Aphalas Cove. He hits Rovlaror from both the north and the south, and having also been able to sneak some other ships just around that part of the Rollothine Passage, having kept the Dracons too occupied to really notice. And they assail, and Rovlaror basically gets sent into chaos incredibly quickly. The land of Haracloch is there is a sizable battle with some casualties, but most of all the forces get driven back despite having mobilized. Because of the two-sided attack, they end up being split, and King Sauron at the time has to pull his forces back. He sends some back to the Spire Hills, the network of hills that link the two sides of Rovlaror, and he also retreats himself and much of his force to the current then capital, at least of the western side, of Jarethil. And Haracloch is a sizable battle, but it's more of a precursor to the siege of Jarethil. And in Jarethil, Tonnreaf probably delivers his second most powerful blow to one of the forces opposing to him. But also has actually the first real blow dealt to him as well, where in the duel against King Sauron, yes, he's able to slay Sauron in the throne room, but Sauron actually becomes the first ever human to inflict any sort of injury on Tonnreaf. And it forces Tonnreaf to actually withdraw, personally withdraw whilst his forces remain. But under the leadership of Sauron's son, Sonkor, the forces of Rovlaror essentially abandon their western territories and retreat further east and hold at the hills and the passage that links the banks of the cove, hoping that eventually Tarasil and other human forces will be able to muster up and come to aid them. Or if the Dragons would be able to repulse, they could potentially aid. But unfortunately, this effort from Sonkor ends up having consequences that eventually, well, I will hint at this as it was on one of the last videos, will eventually lead to the potential downfall of the Kingdom of Rovlaror, much beyond Tonnreaf's war. And I'm probably gonna actually split this into two, but I will cover a few more in this one. And this all occurs into 253 BGS, and Tonnreaf now licking his wounds and everything. The demons effectively, at this point we're going into 250 BGS, there's a little bit of a time skip where basically Tonnreaf's licking his wounds, Rovlaror's been driven back to the hill, Farallon and Thoromsia are still mobilising and trying to recuperate, and the Dragons are completely boxed in, and it proves further and further problematic and everything. But the Tavicorn around about now does actually start getting constructed, then the Dragons taking advantage of the lesser pressure on them to be able to start building it to at least put up some defense. And although the Dragons were actually much belated in hearing about the assault on Rovlaror because they were just too busy fighting their own battles, and the forces of Rovlaror again are now pinned at the hills. There is a small section of them that end up escaping into Dothalon, which is a hidden settlement within the hills to the west of Jarethil. Basically the hills that actually separate Rovlaror and Darenthal. And then we're going into some other elements which cover the events that are going on Schaa and things, but there is a notable thing as it involves the Kingdom of Talamari. And unbeknownst to any of the humans, Tonnreaf had been preparing a more coordinated assault than just Destinal. And in 250 BGS he puts it into motion with a fleet of Dark Elves from Steotha assailing the Talamarith-held Isle of Tartak. And it ends up being quite a battle, but the primary effort of the Talamarith humans is to get their civilians away from there. So with some aid from their own fleet as well as a hastily assembled assistant force of other ships, they rush to basically protect as they withdraw their people to the mainland. And whilst Tartak's warriors are very strong and very fierce, the Dark Elves are just of another quality. And in so many numbers, they are able to attack, and after a year they drive out the rest of the human warriors and even sack the island capital of Tarkanar. And it's only after this that, whilst this is not a battle, King Laros of Talamarith calls for a council where he gets the Elvish High Warden of the Temple Guard, Zaranath, and King Kalerth of Cafaltir together, forming the First Bladed Watch, meeting in a very, well, ever, and they begin coming up with a plan on how to retake Tartak from the Dark Elf occupiers. And the whole effort, understandably, from Tonnreaf to this was to keep Talamarith's eyes separated, as well as the Temple Guard, so that the likes of the Dragons and Rovlaror have two of their allies that could assist them in battle be effectively split in their focus. And I mean, to an extent, Cafaltir as well. Because, again, as I've noted in more recent videos, Cafaltir have the best navy of any human kingdom. So that fleet could easily come and aid Rovlaror, but if their focus is now on Tartak, they will need their ships elsewhere to combat the Dark Elf fleet, which is a very strong fleet. Not the most powerful in the Servants of Nagrasak, but one of the most. And I think for now, at the point of 250 or 249 BGS, that is where I will hold this part 1 video. And we've detailed it through to the fall of Jarathil and the capture of Tartak. It's a pretty decent point to conclude it. So far, we've seen the disappearance of one leader, the death of another, and the next details will be going into basically the responses of the rest of Destinal. And whilst I did state that I'm not going to cover it, I will just throw in the notions that at these points the Forest Dwarfs and the Ajati are in a mess of battles against Nagrasak's forces and Steotha. Meanwhile, Sarakarth have been motioning and moving forces towards Naros, where they're about to engage and assault the trolls, which prevents the trolls coming to the aid of the Dracons despite later on being wished and requested. And yeah, Tonnreaf's War is, out of the 3 major timeline things that I've covered so far, Tonnreaf's War is the biggest. So, and it's also the most spread, as it covers all 3, where, well, actually no, that's not true, Galakaros is, but yeah, his mass coordinated assault keep the other protector races distracted, and also use other allies to keep even a couple of the human forces or multi-purpose forces caught up and awkward because Tonnreaf's main objective and his main enemy throughout all of his time on Aphalas in his life and before is always the Dracons. The Dracons have always been his basic nemesis above every other force, and he yearns to pretty much just destroy them. And yeah, that is where I'm going to be wrapping it up. Like I said, for this part 1, there will be a part 2 that covers the next, because this has been the first essential 31 years of the conflict, and there is another at least another, I think, around about 15 years to cover. So the second part might actually be potentially a little bit shorter. But one thing I will say is that in all of this conflict and everything that happens, Tonnreaf is not killed. He does survive. And that ends up boding problems for other forces in Aphalas later down the line. But anyway, for those of you who have enjoyed this video, please do the old subscribey and like and comment if you want stuff. I am focusing on the lore a bit more at the moment and doing this dedicated video instead of multi-purposing it with stream like I've been doing with some recent ones, as I wanted to detail, and this is going to require a fair amount of edits, like adding in, well, it won't actually require that many edits, just keeping a list and showcasing the political map. But obviously the last part of the trilogy is coming soon, and I'm hoping that it will actually release not too long after this video releases. This video is being recorded a day or so before it's going to be released, so hopefully it will not be too long. And being able to do is quite fun, being able to do a part 1 and part 2. I was very tempted to continue on what I was talking with Arison and things, or other characters, like thinking about what actually is going on with one of or a couple of the characters who currently in the present point in the lore have vanished. But I think I'm going to leave that for a little bit and focus on what I've been saying for a while, which is going through a bit more detail of Tonnreaf's War, the Years of Sorrow, and Galakaros to bring up to where it is in the lore. And then eventually I will do a chronological playlist of where everything lies. But if you would like to support the channel, the Ko-fi page is down in the description, which also holds the shop for the books and the ebooks. There is many other links. The social posts are becoming more frequent now. I've gotten schedule up, so there will be more consistent updates and posts on the different platforms now. And until next time, welcome to the Kingdom of Aphalas and the world of Fellow Mind books. Thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed. And if you would like to see some similar content to this one, you can click there. Or if you would like to change around and have an explore of some of the other content, then you can check out the link below, which will be to a playlist. And if you would like to check out the content on other pages or socials, or if you would like to explore some of the other elements in detail, or pick up a book or whatever, or come and chat to me on Twitch when I'm alive, then down there. And as you can see, it has a list of what to expect on each of those platforms. And until next time, welcome to the Kingdom of Aphalas, the world of fellow mind books. Please do like, please do subscribe, and if you want to, pop out a comment.